Hi, welcome to episode 13 of Pink's Picks Recommendations from a Retired English Teacher. Today I'll be discussing, contrasting, comparing two different works by James Baldwin. His first novel, written in 1952, Go Tell It on a Mountain, and one of his later novels, If Beale Street Could Talk, written in 1974, and the basis for Barry Jenkins' 2018 award-winning film. Okay, starting with Go Tell It in the Mountain. It is written in three parts, and the parts are broken down, part two, into three segments, and each of the parts in each of those segments has its own epigraph. And the epigraphs are from Revelations, Isaiah, bluegrass lyrics, a Christmas hymn. So that's very, very clever. Um, Also, it should be noted that we have shifting third person narration, primarily from the perspective of John. And this is on John's 14th birthday. And the entire book takes place in the course of this one 24-hour period. However, again, we do have the flashbacks with the shifting narration to relatives of John's. It's set in March of 1935. Um, what I like about this book is Baldwin's use specifically of stylistic devices. We have allusions to Greek mythology, quite a bit of parallelism and juxtaposition that he uses seamlessly. We have beautiful imagery of Central Park and John's walking down Fifth Avenue, um, all the way to the New York Public Library, and his descriptions and his excitement about this area is just contagious. I would say that it's antithetical to a Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye's walk through the streets of Manhattan because John is appreciating the beauty, whereas, of course, Holden in his depression is finding issues with everything. That's not to say that John doesn't long for another life. He's even concerned whether or not anyone will remember that it is his birthday, but his ability to walk from Harlem and travel through the rest of Manhattan uh, is very compelling. There's lots of clothing imagery, which I love. Um, we have his repetition of words such as silent and shame, which end up becoming a motif as well, which is something similar to what we see in If Beale Street Could Talk. Also, something similar that we have to If Beale Street Could Talk um, is the universal idea of some identity issues, as well as some of the profanity and the vivid sex scenes. Additionally, we have a character who is falsely accused of a crime and the racism that is involved there. With Beale Street Could Talk, we have 197 pages. We only have two chapters. Both of those are named, and the first chapter is 171 pages, and the second is only 16 pages. This is primarily in first person narration from the perspective of Tish. We do have author intrusion injected into that narration, as well as testimony from witnesses to the crime or so-called witnesses to the crime. And we shift to third person omniscient at one portion of the book as well. I love Baldwin's clever use of nicknames. In the case of Tish's family, those nicknames endear us to characters. I feel that with the use of nicknames for her boyfriend Fonny's family, those nicknames tend to distance us from characters. Um, we have here the motif again of shame and silence, but we also have added the motif with the repetition of the word time and the word trouble, which is used euphemistically to describe a pregnancy as well as to describe many of the issues that the characters are confronting. In this particular book, instead of New York City, well, Manhattan specifically, being described in all its beauty, it's described more in its racism and as an ugly city, which again is very, very different from Go Tell It on the Mountain. But it's different times in the 70s with the civil unrest at that particular time. He employs juxtaposition and parallelism as well. There's far more profanity in this book and quite a bit of colloquialism that is indicative of the 1970s, men referring to each other as cats, sometimes cool cats or funky cats. He uses the term jive ass shit. Um, Policemen are referred to as pigs. Um, if you're looking for agreement, can you dig it? Um, Man, the word man is used more pervasively than it is in today's society, and bread for money. Many references to music: Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Billie Holiday, um, and uh, specifically A Rose for Spanish Harlem, which I was surprised to learn was written by Phil Spector, for heaven's sakes. It was sung in 1960 by Benny King and in 1971 by Aretha Franklin. Um, there's the passion for art and love from our protagonist and her boyfriend Fonnie, who is in fact a sculptor. Um, we have from the present to flashbacks to the reflective past and also to the future. We have very long paragraphs in this, followed by clipped dialogue, which reminds me, in that case, of Hemingway. Um, we have in this book as well what I see as onomastic imagery with the Rivers family, which is Tish's, the narrator's family, and the Rivers. We think how the Rivers family actually goes with the flow no matter what is happening in their family or no matter how tragic. Whereas Fonnie's family, their last name is Hunt, and there's the hunt of the land dweller, if you will, and they can't seem to uh, move out of their negative attitudes. Um, Also, something that I liked about Go Tell on the Mountain is that reminded me kind of Faulkner. There is a 3-page sermon in here when John is at church, and this sermon was so reminiscent of the sermon in the Dilsey section of Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. There's also a clever conceit in that sermon where the enthusiasm of the congregants is compared to childbirth and with the moaning and the crying and so on and so forth. I would highly recommend these books. I definitely give them both an A. For further reading, a book called Giovanni's Room, also by Baldwin, uh, was listed in the 10 controversial classics for Banned Book Week, which was late September of 2019. So you might want to consider that title as well. Also, we have a book that was published on June 30th, and it is by Eddie S. Glaude, and he is the Distinguished Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Princeton. And the title of his book is called Begin Again. And a New York Times nonfiction book critic, writes that it blends biography, criticism, and memoir to make sense of America today. It is, in fact, about James Baldwin. And that New York Times book critic furthers that even if you don't agree with Glaude's interpretations, you'll find yourself productively arguing with them. He parses, he pronounces, he cajoles. He spurs you to revisit Baldwin's work yourself, and that you should. Next time, I will be discussing two titles that both have the word river in it. Until then, take care, be safe, and do your homework.